Sense and Sensibility is the story of sisters Eleanor and Marianne Dashwood. Eleanor represents sense, Marianne represents sensibility, and the moral of the story is that sensibility without sense is a bad thing. Or as author Lucy Worsley describes it in her 2019 Jane Austen biography, Jane Austen at Home, the over-emotional Marianne is taught a lesson and learns to control her feelings, while sensible Eleanor is rewarded for holding hers in check. Unfortunately for Jane Austen, books that try to teach the reader a moral of some kind have gone out of fashion since 1811, and we can see that clearly in the way that most modern readers and critics respond to Sense and Sensibility. One of my favorite parts of researching this series was watching ostensibly objective critics try to justify their dislike of Sense and Sensibility. For example, if we take a look at the 1986 essay collection, The Jane Austen Companion, John Bailey's essay entitled Characterization in Jane Austen considers Eleanor and Marianne to be her biggest failures in creating characters. Her two earliest heroines, Eleanor and Marianne in Sense and Sensibility, are constructed from principles that invade their speech and behavior to such an extent that the second never achieves the true status of a Jane Austen character, and the first only precariously. They remain derivative of Jane Austen's models and lack that potential for and of the absurd that is the clue to the success of her main characters. Or if we take a look at the second edition of Sandra M. Gilbert and Suzanne Gubar's 1979 book, The Mad Woman in the Attic, The Woman Writer and the 19th Century Literary Imagination, they call Sense and Sensibility a quote-unquote painful reading experience. Sense and Sensibility is an especially painful novel to read because Austen herself seems caught between her attraction to Marianne's sincerity and spontaneity, while at the same time identifying with the civil falsehoods and the reserved, polite silences of Eleanor. And at certain points, I have to admit, I was thinking, it's okay, you guys. You can just say that you don't like Sense and Sensibility. Nobody is going to take your PhD away. But looking at both casual and critical responses to Jane Austen's debut novel, we can see that Lucy Worsley seems justified in asking, why did she start by publishing the novel that is the least favorite of most modern readers? As someone who just finished reading Sense and Sensibility in preparation for this series, I'm not going to pretend that reading Sense and Sensibility is anywhere near as fun as reading, say, Pride and Prejudice. Consider, for example, the characters. Not the characters themselves necessarily, but simply the sheer number of characters who appear in this book. The first paragraph of Sense and Sensibility alone is overwhelming with the amount of information and the number of characters that it expects you to remember. Here is that first paragraph. Oh, and it is helpful to keep in mind that this is the paragraph that introduced Jane Austen into the world. The family of Dashwood had long been settled in Sussex. Their estate was large, and their residence was at Norland Park, in the center of their property, where, for many generations, they had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintance. The late owner of this estate was a single man who lived to a very advanced age, and who, for many years of his life, had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. But her death, which happened 10 years before his own, produced a great alteration in his home. For to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. In the society of his nephew and niece and their children, the old gentleman's days were comfortably spent. His attachment to them all increased. The constant attention of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Dashwood to his wishes, which proceeded not merely from interest, but from goodness of heart, gave him every degree of solid comfort which his age could receive, and the cheerfulness of the children added a relish to his existence. As you can tell from this opening paragraph, we are following the Dashwood family, or more specifically, we are following Mrs. Henry Dashwood's two oldest daughters, Eleanor and Marianne. I hope you're following along, because we are just getting started with listing off the characters in this book. If we are only counting the characters who appear in scenes, on page, on screen, so to speak, and who appear more than once, we have 17 major characters in this book. Yes, I counted. And I am now not only going to list off these 17 characters, I am also going to explain who they are and how they are connected to all of the other characters in this book. Are you ready? All right, let's do this. After Mr. Henry Dashwood's death, John, Mrs. Henry Dashwood's stepson, inherits everything. John is newly married to Fanny, who convinces him that it's perfectly fine to leave his stepmother and half-sisters with a very small amount of money to live on. As a result, Mrs. Dashwood and her three daughters, Eleanor, Marianne, and Margaret, are forced to move to Barton Cottage, a small property adjoining Barton Park. Barton Park is owned by Sir John Middleton, who is married to Lady Middleton. Once the Dashwood women are settled at Barton Cottage, they meet not only the Middletons, but also Lady Middleton's widowed mother, Mrs. Jennings. A few months into their new life at Barton Cottage, Sir John runs into Miss Steele and Miss Lucy Steele, sisters who turn out to be Mrs. Jennings' relatives and who come to stay at Barton Park. But that is not the end of Mrs. Jennings' relatives, because her daughter and son-in-law, Mr. and Mrs. Palmer, also come to stay at Barton Park. Meanwhile, in the midst of all of this socializing, Marianne has found herself in a love triangle. She has fallen for Willoughby, a young man who is friends with Sir John, but there is another man, Colonel Brandon, another one of Sir John's friends, who has fallen in love with her. Speaking of love, Eleanor is secretly in love with her sister-in-law Fanny's brother, Edward Ferrars, and she believes that he is also in love with her, but is not able to propose because Eleanor further assumes he is so firmly under the thumb of his domineering mother, Mrs. Ferrars. Why does Eleanor find this man attractive? Who knows? It remains one of literature's enduring mysteries. If we bring in side characters who don't actually appear in any scenes, but who are crucial to the plot, we also have Willoughby's elderly relation who he stays with while he's at Barton Park. We have Eliza Brandon, who was Colonel Brandon's first love, but who ended up socially disgraced after having a child out of wedlock. And we have Eliza Williams, who is Eliza Brandon's illegitimate daughter. That brings our character count up to 20. And I think any modern reader will feel the need to ask, why are there so many of them? Look, it is easy enough to critique Sense and Sensibility. The dialogue in particular is often the target of criticism, but the dialogue in this book can also be brilliant. Let's take, for example, the most famous scene from Sense and Sensibility, the scene where Fanny Dashwood convinces her husband John that it is perfectly acceptable to leave his stepmother and half-sisters penniless. "It was my father's last request to me," replied her husband, "that I should assist his widow and daughters. He did not know what he was talking of, I dare say, 10 to 1, but he was light-headed at the time. Had he been in his right senses, he could not have thought of such a thing as begging you to give away half your fortune from your own child. Perhaps, then, it would be better for all parties if the sum were diminished 1/2. £500 would be a prodigious increase to their fortunes. Oh, beyond anything great, what brother on earth would do half so much for his sisters, even if really his sisters? And, as it is, only half blood. But you have such a generous spirit. I think I may afford to give them £500 apiece. As it is, without any addition of mine, they will each have about £3,000 on their mother's death. A very comfortable fortune for any young woman. To be sure it is, and indeed it strikes me that they can want no addition at all. They will have £10,000 divided amongst them. If they marry, they will be sure of doing well. And if they do not, they may all live very comfortably together on the interest of £10,000. To say the truth, I am convinced within myself that your father had no idea of your giving them any money at all. The assistance he thought of, I dare say, was only such as might be reasonably expected of you. For instance, such as looking out for a comfortable small house for them, helping them to move their things, and sending them presents of fish and game, and so forth, whenever they are in season. I'll lay my life that he meant nothing farther. Indeed, it would be very strange and unreasonable if he did. Do but consider, my dear Mr. Dashwood, how excessively comfortable your mother-in-law and her daughters may live on the interest of £7,000, besides the £1,000 belonging to each of the girls, which brings them in £50 a year apiece. And of course, they will pay their mother for their board out of it. Altogether, they will have 500 a year amongst them. And what on earth can 4 women want for more than that? They will live so cheap. Their housekeeping will be nothing at all. They will have no carriage, no horses, and hardly any servants. They will keep no company and can have no expenses of any kind. Only conceive how comfortable they will be. 500 a year! I am sure I cannot imagine how they will spend half of it. And as to your giving them more, it is quite absurd to think of it. They will be much more able to give you something. Upon my word, said Mr. Dashwood, I believe you are perfectly right. My father certainly can mean nothing more by his request to me than what you say. I clearly understand it now, and I will strictly fulfill my engagement by such acts of assistance and kindness to them as you have described. This is not the full conversation, by the way. I had to abridge it in the interest of time, but if you've never read Sense and Sensibility, I highly recommend reading chapter 2 in its entirety, because this conversation is a masterclass in manipulation and selfishness. John and Fanny Dashwood are the kind of petty villains that you encounter in everyday life, and this is illustrated brilliantly in their dialogue. But what is also revealing about this conversation is the emphasis on money, because if Jane Austen cared about anything, she cared about money. And there is no better example of this than her debut novel, Sense and Sensibility. Part 2, In a Rich Man's World. Do you know the ABBA song, Money, Money, Money? The chorus goes, money, money, money in a rich man's world. And this song is often playing in the back of my mind when I read Jane Austen, because every Jane Austen book is, to a greater or lesser extent, about money. Why? Well, the simplest explanation is that as a woman in Georgian/Regency England who never married, Jane Austen spent a lot of time thinking about money. If we go back to that 1986 essay collection I referenced earlier, The Jane Austen Companion, there is an essay by Edward Copeland entitled Jane Austen and the Consumer Revolution. In that essay, Copeland writes, "The Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution may lie at the far horizons of Jane Austen's novels, but the Consumer Revolution, the extraordinary explosion of economic energy that took place in Great Britain during her lifetime, most certainly does not." But what place do women have in this consumer society? Here's what Copeland says. Women, however, are in a paradoxical situation in such an economy. They are important consumers, but they have no means of generating income. Now let's bring the conversation back to Sense and Sensibility. When people talk about this book, they almost always note that for a Jane Austen novel, it is unusually serious, unusually dark and depressing. And that unusually dark and depressing atmosphere stems directly from the harsh financial realities that underscore the book. As Edward Copeland says in Jane Austen and the Consumer Revolution, in Sense and Sensibility, the wicked, the stupid, and the selfish are rewarded financially, exercise power without control, and are, by their own lights, successful without check. The series of financial acts that direct the plots are themselves negative assertions of economic tyranny. The ungrateful uncle disinherits his nieces. Fanny and John Dashwood refuse to help the Dashwood women in their straitened circumstances. Copeland notes the frightening power that money seems to have in this novel, and he specifically points to the disparity in the characters' incomes. The gaps in income are enormous. Marianne Dashwood can bring £1,000 to a marriage, or £50 per annum. Miss Grey is an heiress character. Miss Grey brings £50,000 or £2,500 per annum. Robert Ferrars is Edward Ferrars's brother. Robert Ferrars has £1,000 per annum. Edward has only 1/10 that amount. Given this all-important financial context, we could argue that this is the central question that Sense and Sensibility is trying to answer. Can you separate money and happiness, or are they intrinsically linked? In this world of economic tyranny, where the wicked, the stupid, and the selfish are rewarded financially, is it possible to find happiness? Every Jane Austen book is about love, or at least about marriage. As Rachel M. Brownstein writes in her essay, Northanger Abbey, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, for the Cambridge Companion to Jane Austen, like all Jane Austen's novels, Sense and Sensibility is a comedy that ends in marriages, which traditionally affirm the connections between sexes and families, and between desire and public ritual or social convention. Sense and Sensibility may be a comedy in terms of genre, but there are few Jane Austen novels where the heroines have to go through so much pain, shame, and public humiliation in order to reach their happy ever afters. Let's begin with Marianne. Marianne falls in love with the handsome and seductive Willoughby, who charms her by agreeing with her about literally everything. Their taste was strikingly alike. The same books, the same passages were idolized by each, or if any difference appeared, any objection arose, it lasted no longer than till the force of her arguments and the brightness of her eyes could be displayed. He acquiesced in all her decisions, caught all her enthusiasm, and long before his visit concluded, they conversed with the familiarity of a long-established acquaintance. Marianne thinks that this is it. She has found happy ever after. But instead of proposing, Willoughby abandons Marianne and runs off to London. And when Marianne follows him to London and confronts him in a crowded ballroom, he humiliates her. "Good heavens!" she exclaimed. "He is there! He is there! Oh, why does he not look at me? Why cannot I speak to him?" At last, he, Willoughby, turned round again and regarded them both, She started up and, pronouncing his name in a tone of affection, held out her hand to him. He approached and, addressing himself rather to Eleanor than Marianne, as if wishing to avoid her eye and determined not to observe her attitude, inquired in a hurried manner after Mrs. Dashwood and asked how long they had been in town. Eleanor was robbed of all presence of mind by such an address and was unable to say a word. But the feelings of her sister were instantly expressed. Her face was crimsoned over, and she exclaimed, in a voice of the greatest emotion, "Good God, Willoughby! What is the meaning of this? Have you not received my letters? Will you not shake hands with me?" He could not then avoid it, but her touch seemed painful to him, and he held her hand only for a moment. During all this time, he was evidently struggling for composure. Eleanor watched his countenance and saw its expression becoming more tranquil. After a moment's pause, he spoke with calmness. "I did myself the honor of calling in Berkeley Street last Tuesday, and very much regretted that I was not fortunate enough to find yourselves and Mrs. Jennings at home. My card was not lost, I hope." "But have you not received my notes?" cried Marianne in the wildest anxiety. "Here is some mistake, I am sure, some dreadful mistake. What can be the meaning of it? Tell me, Willoughby, for heaven's sake, tell me, what is the matter?" He made no reply. His complexion changed, and all his embarrassment returned, but as if, on catching the eye of the young lady with whom he had previously been talking, he felt the necessity of instant exertion. He recovered himself again, and after saying, "Yes, I had the pleasure of receiving the information of your arrival in town, which you were so good as to send me," turned hastily away with a slight bow and joined his friend. Marianne, now looking dreadfully white and unable to stand, sunk into her chair, and Eleanor, expecting every moment to see her faint, tried to screen her from the observation of others while reviving her with lavender water. The young lady Willoughby is talking to here, his quote-unquote friend, is his fiancée, Miss Grey, who is an heiress with £50,000. Willoughby marries Miss Grey. Marianne falls deathly ill. Willoughby flies to her and confesses that he still loves her, that he will always love her. He leaves again, Marianne recovers, and she eventually marries Colonel Brandon, a man who is only 5 years younger than her own mother. Eleanor's love life is less dramatic, but equally painful. She has fallen in love with her sister-in-law Fanny's oldest brother, Edward. Edward, however, is secretly engaged to Mrs. Jennings' relative, Lucy Steele. And Lucy, suspecting that Edward and Eleanor have feelings for each other, makes sure to tell Eleanor about their engagement. "You will think my question an odd one, I dare say," said Lucy to her one day as they were walking together from the park to the cottage. "But pray, are you personally acquainted with your sister-in-law's mother, Mrs. Ferrars?" "I am sorry, I do not," said Eleanor in great astonishment. "If it could be of any use to you to know my opinion of her. But really, I never understood that you were at all connected with that family, and therefore I am a little surprised, I confess, at so serious an inquiry into her character." "I dare say you are, and I am sure I do not at all wonder at it. But if I dared tell you all, you would not be so much surprised. Mrs. Ferrars is certainly nothing to me at present, but the time may come. How soon it will come must depend upon herself, when we may be very intimately connected. She looked down as she said this, amiably bashful, with only one side glance at her companion to observe its effect on her. "Good heavens!" cried Eleanor. "What do you mean? Are you acquainted with Mr. Robert Ferrars? Can you be?" And she did not feel much delighted with the idea of such a sister-in-law. "No," replied Lucy, "not to Mr. Robert Ferrars. I never saw him in my life, but," fixing her eyes upon Eleanor, "to his eldest brother." Eleanor, for a few moments, remained silent. Her astonishment at what she heard was at first too great for words, but at length, forcing herself to speak, and to speak cautiously, she said, with calmness of manner, which tolerably well concealed her surprise and solicitude, "May I ask if your engagement is of long standing? We have been engaged these 4 years. 4 years? Yes." But when Lucy and Edward's engagement is eventually revealed, Edward's formidable mother, Mrs. Ferrars, disowns him in favor of his younger brother, Robert. And Lucy, without missing a beat, dumps Edward and runs off with Robert, leaving Edward and Eleanor finally free to marry. I think the strange thing about Sense and Sensibility is that in spite of all this drama and passion, it feels extremely unromantic. I could point to a few reasons for this. First, this book has an extremely cynical view of marriage as an institution. Another reason that Sense and Sensibility feels so unromantic is because the two endgame love interests are so unappealing. Eleanor's endgame love interest is Edward Ferrars. Marianne's endgame love interest is Colonel Brandon. And I find it extremely hard to believe that either of these men is anyone's romantic ideal. I have heard Jane Austen fans say that they're looking for their Mr. Darcy or they're looking for their Mr. Knightley, but I have never heard, and I never expect to hear, anyone say that they're looking for their Edward Ferrars or their Colonel Brandon. I am not alone in thinking that the love interests in Sense and Sensibility are uncharismatic, to say the least. Rachel Brownstein, for example, points to, quote, "the depressing similarity among the 3 men who court the Dashwood sisters." Brownstein, though, goes even further in her essay because she points to how the structure of the story itself undermines and parodies the very idea of romantic love. Lucy's calculating approach to life and her prohibited love affair with Edward caricature Eleanor's, and the passionate love that nearly destroys Marianne is elaborately parodied by the story of the 2 Elizas that Colonel Brandon tells. The details of that story echo the novel's plots and its themes of selfishness and greed. Debates about taste seem a luxury, and true gentility a romantic dream, as a divorce and a couple of seductions, a fall into a life of sin and an illegitimate birth, a secret engagement, and even a duel touch the lives of scrupulous and sensitive Marianne and Eleanor Dashwood. Brownstein actually argues that the deepest and most lasting relationship in the book is not between a man and a woman, it is between Eleanor and Marianne. As she says, the concluding paragraph brilliantly undoes the romantic resolution by startlingly giving Eleanor's and Marianne's attachments to their husbands seem merely secondary. And in case you want to judge for yourself, here is the concluding paragraph of Sense and Sensibility. Between Barton and Delaford, there was that constant communication which strong family affection would naturally dictate. And among the merits and the happiness of Eleanor and Marianne, let it not be ranked as the least considerable that, though sisters and living almost within sight of each other, they could live without disagreement between themselves or producing coolness between their husbands. The message of Sense and Sensibility seems to be that if it's possible to find real happiness in this world of financial instability and economic tyranny, where the undeserving hold all of the money and therefore all of the power, then that happiness is found not in romantic ideals of marriage or love, but in the tried and true bonds of sisterhood. Part 3. Eleanor and Marianne. What I think makes Sense and Sensibility such a fundamentally strange reading experience is that there is a central tension in the construction of the story that is never fully resolved. On the one hand, Eleanor and Marianne are real characters who have to make difficult choices to achieve some level of happiness. On the other hand, they are stereotypes that Jane Austen is using to make an argument about the contemporary debate between sense and sensibility. In 1811, when Sense and Sensibility was published, sensibility did not just refer to being emotionally sensitive. It referred instead to what Lucy Worsley describes as the contemporary cult of sensibility. Here's how she explains it in Jane Austen at Home. Known as the English malady, sensibility had, by the middle of the 18th century, become a fashionable affliction for the well-off. It was a classy kind of problem from which to suffer, for your nerves only became dangerously sensitive if you had plenty of leisure time and therefore lots of money to indulge them. This supposed susceptibility to both feelings and illnesses was deeply annoying to those who did not indulge in it. But if you did want to appear delicate, full of sensibility, refined, it was a good idea to start by reading novels. And as people started to read more novels with their high-blown, elevated notions about love and romance, they actually began to write to their own real-life lovers in the same sensitive, romantic terms. The cult of sensibility had reached its fullest, finest moment in Jane's youth. By the middle of the 18th century, people had had quite enough of sensibility. The modern woman, wrote Mary Robinson crossly, disdains to be strong-minded because she fears being accounted masculine. She trembles at every breeze, faints at every peril, and yields to every assailant. In Sense and Sensibility, Eleanor is sense and Marianne is sensibility. If Marianne's character comes across as dramatic, over-emotional, or just a bit exaggerated, you can chalk it up to the fact that she is a representative of a cultural phenomenon that valued the dramatic, the over-emotional, and the exaggerated. Eleanor and Marianne are often positioned as opposites in the narrative, and the moral of the story seems to be a relatively straightforward one. In the sense versus sensibility debate, sense is most definitely the winner. But if we take a closer look at Eleanor and Marianne, you'll notice something interesting. For example, consider the following scene. Edward has come to visit the Dashwood women, and as usual, he is complaining about his mother, Mrs. Ferrars. Mrs. Ferrars wants her oldest son to become a famous public figure, like, for example, a politician, but Edward has no interest. And it is when Edward is discussing how he has no interest in his mother's plans for his life that we get a really interesting conversation between Eleanor and Marianne. Edward: I have no wish to be distinguished, and have every reason to hope I never shall. Thank heaven, I cannot be forced into genius and eloquence. Eleanor: you have no ambition, I well know. Your wishes are all moderate. Edward: as moderate as those of the rest of the world, I believe. I wish as well as everybody else to be perfectly happy, but like everybody else, it must be in my own way. Greatness will not make me so. Strange that it would, cried Marianne. What have wealth or grandeur to do with happiness? Grandeur has but little, said Eleanor, but wealth has much to do with it. Eleanor, for shame, said Marianne. Money can only give happiness where there is nothing else to give it. Beyond a competence, it can afford no real satisfaction as far as mere self is concerned. Perhaps, said Eleanor, smiling, we may come to the same point. Your competence and my wealth are very much alike, I dare say. And without them, as the world goes now, we shall both agree that every kind of external comfort must be wanting. Your ideas are only more noble than mine. Come, what is your competence? About 1,800 or 2,000 a year. Not more than that. Eleanor laughed. 2,000 a year? One is my wealth. I guessed how it would end. And yet, 2,000 a year is a very moderate income, said Marianne. A family cannot well be maintained on a smaller. I am sure I am not extravagant in my demands. A proper establishment of servants, a carriage, perhaps two, and hunters cannot be supported on less. Let's examine how this conversation unfolds. Marianne begins with the abstract, idealistic statement that happiness has nothing to do with wealth or grandeur. This is in line with Marianne's general character, because when she speaks, she tends to speak in abstractions. She tends to live in her own idealistic world. Eleanor then counters with the down-to-earth statement that actually wealth and happiness are linked. This is also in line with Eleanor's character, not only because her dialogue tends to be more grounded, but also because her dialogue consistently reveals her awareness of the reality she is forced to live in. Both Eleanor and Marianne are very much aware that even a small increase in their finances would make them much more comfortable. But the only person who is willing to acknowledge that is Eleanor. We can see this in Marianne's response to Eleanor, where she claims that as long as you have enough to survive on, having more money, quote, can afford no real satisfaction. And at this point, Eleanor smiles because she has realized that, quote, we may come to the same point. She asks Marianne how much money exactly she would need to survive on, and Marianne says about 1,800 or 2,000 a year. Eleanor laughs because when she said wealth, she was thinking of 1,000 pounds a year. So exactly half of what Marianne terms survival. For all of Marianne's abstract idealism, her grasp on reality is actually not that bad. For all of her abstract idealism, she's not that different from Eleanor. In Rachel Brownstein's essay for the Cambridge Companion to Jane Austen, she supports this argument. While the action of the novel is mediated by the consciousness of the prudent sister, the narrative rewards both equally. Marianne and Eleanor are more interestingly alike than they are different. The first chapter acknowledges that Marianne has sense and sensibility, and that Eleanor has an excellent heart and strong feelings as well as prudence. Marianne's sensibility does have consequences. She falls in love with the untrustworthy Willoughby, and after he abandons her, she falls critically ill. But, crucially, she does not actually die. She gets better, she marries, and she builds a more or less happy life. If the point of Sense and Sensibility was simply that Eleanor is always right and Marianne is always wrong, then why does Marianne deserve to be happy? Why, as Brownstein puts it, does the narrative reward both equally? No matter how often Eleanor and Marianne annoy or irritate each other, these sisters care for each other deeply. And I would argue that any ending where Marianne is unequivocally punished would not be a happy ending for either of them. Eleanor doesn't want Marianne to be punished. She wants Marianne to understand that you can't live life through sensibility alone. The message of the book is not sense good, sensibility bad. The message of the book is that life is not about feelings or logic alone. It is about finding a balance. The message of the book is that it is not just Eleanor or just Marianne who deserves happiness. The message is that they both do.